Alrighty, great. Well, I see people trickling in, so I will once in a while sort of reiterate that this is an interactive session. What I'm going to be doing today is, if you haven't checked out the description for this event, I am going to be using this book, Ruined by Design by Mike Monteiro, as a jumping off point for discussion. So in the description, the general expectation is that you have, checked out the book, but you are absolutely welcome to actually join in the discussion if you haven't. So I'm not going to be just spending this next, chunk of time talking about the book and just me speaking. I'm also, not going to be sticking strictly to the text. I'm going to use the topics that you can see. If you actually scroll down this video window, you'll see some topics that I've sort of set out. And you'll be able to see those and use those as jumping off points for what we'd like to talk about. Just to get a sense of who's in the room, would you guys mind either throwing in the chat? You could also just jump in to camera and video or just audio right now. If you want to put in the chat, if you've read the book, a quick hello, any intro that you'd like to make. That would actually be super, super great if folks want to introduce themselves before we get started. Crickets. Who's shy? You can do a thumbs up, you can do a thumbs down. Read the book in 2019. Oh, maybe I think it's because is there a chat delay? I feel like I have some distant recollection of like a slight chat delay. So we've got read most of the book, read the book in 2019. Sounds good. Okay.
Josh is typing.
Josh is typing. We got the ... dots. Alrighty, so folks have already, some folks have read the book. Once in a while, if you hear some background noise, I was originally going to be doing this session from home, but there is Comcast decided internet was going to get construction work done today, so I'm somewhere else. There may be occasional interruptions. But it sounds like a couple of you have actually read the book and have read some similar-ish titles. Josh, what kinds of other books have you read that are on this topic? You can go ahead and type while I keep rambling, but I actually am curious what other books you have read. But as a reiterate, I know a couple people just joined in. This is actually a session where you are invited to join on the stage. You could have your audio on, you can chit chat, but you're actually welcome to participate. This is not going to be a me talking at you session. But while people are introducing themselves or typing, I will go ahead and just get started with introducing this book. So first off, I introduced It's Ruined by Design by Mike Monteiro, how designers destroyed the world and what we can do to fix it. So this is a book that has a lot of hot takes, a lot of strong language, and generally, all right, so I see, by the way, am I able to do moderator things, Dave? I see like a moderation pop up actually on my screen before I keep going.
It's very likely at the lower left. Is there a moderation button?
All right, and am I able to add people in?
Click on it and see what happens. I would expect you are, but I don't know that for sure.
All righty, because Josh is coming.
There's Josh.
Hi, Josh.
Great. So you can do that as well. Excellent.
Great. That's awesome. That's perfect. I can actually moderate this myself. That works even better. Thanks for the interruptions, folks. I'm learning the hop-in tech way of doing things. But jumping right back into it, this book is one that has a lot of strong language, hot takes, and is really thinking about accountability and what it means to be like a designer, working in product, working in tech, and what we collectively have and have not done right, what things are going wrong, and what we can potentially do. So it is not exactly a pessimistic book. It is actually one that has a lot of sort of galvanizing ideas. And it really is pushing the reader essentially to think critically about what products you're working on, why are you working on them, who do they affect, and in many ways kind of like knocking on the doors of a lot of big companies that, Mike thinks have not done good for society when you actually back out of what they're doing and sort of their like micro interaction lens. A brief introduction of myself. I am actually not a designer. I am a UX researcher, research ops professional. I'm currently doing an internship at InstaWork, so I'm tuning in from their office right now. So I'm not actually a designer. I am a researcher, but I think that the word, the text that was focused, what this book focuses on is applicable to anyone who is in any sort of decision-making role in product, in any sort of product-focused company. So if you have hands on what ends up going into a digital product, this book is for you. So specifically, he says, not everyone is a designer, but people do design whether they are designers or not. So that is the lens that I am coming to this from, is from the sort of UX researcher perspective. But I'd really love to hear like what you guys think as I'm talking through this, about what the topics in this book mean for your role, whether you are a designer, you're a product person, you are something else. I would love to have your thoughts. Please type in the chat as we go, add your thoughts, add your commentary. I want this to be very freeform, rapid fire. This is participatory, and feel free to come on the stage and unmute yourself. The goal for me is to not actually be doing the talking this entire time. So if you have something to say, please just jump in and go ahead and interrupt me. But without further ado, I'm going to actually get into it. As a reminder, potential topics are actually down below if you scroll down from this video window. It doesn't look like you can interact with it, but you actually can. So overall, this session is going to be me going through favorite well-worded quotes as a sort of go-to, and then when do you try to make a change from within a company, and when do you choose to leave? Earning a living versus doing the right thing. The author had some particular ideas that he wants to push forward, being a designer code of ethics and needing a license to practice design. Who is ultimately accountable for a product's downstream effects? Common monsters in tech products, how to take off your own blinders, and what can you do? I'd like to broaden that question out to anyone who's in this room with me, to what have you done or what have you tried to do? So if people have things that, if I'm saying something that speaks to your experience, please feel free to put something in the chat or request to join the stage and interrupt. I encourage interruptions here if you have a thought that you want to share. So this is unlike other sessions where like I am the speaker. I would rather think of myself as the facilitator here. So unlike other situations, please jump in, please interrupt, please join in at any time. So to start things off in a participatory fashion, of the topics that you guys see below, are there any that you would like to start with first? While you guys are typing, I will just do a quick intro of the topics in the book, the broad sections, but then after that, I'm actually going to run off of what you guys have put in the chat. So as you guys are voting and typing, I will do a little bit of chatting here. So the contents of the book are, how designers destroyed the world. That's part one. Moving fast and breaking things. Excuse my language. There's going to be some very, strongly worded quotes in this book, but moving forward and breaking things. Ayn Rand was a dick. From Bauhaus to Courthouse, all the white boys in the room are the 4 chapters in How Designers Destroyed the World, part 1. Part 2 is what we can do to fix it. Choosing where to work, how to set up for success. The monsters will kill, which is the whole chapter that just goes into dark patterns, problems, things that he's just seen recurring over and over that have a bad effect on, society and the people who use these products. Persuading people is easy. When to throw your body on the gears. And finally, you can't go it alone. The case for community, the case for professional organizations, and the case for licensing and regulation. I've got 2 votes for when do you try to make change from within a company and when do you choose to leave? Is there anyone else who wants to throw in a vote here? I see there are 15 of you in here, and I've got 1 entry in the chat. All right, I've got 2 more votes here, but I want to get at least 1 or 2 more topic votes here, because I see a good chunk of you in here, and this is a participatory session. So, all right, I'm getting some more thumbs up. When do you try to make change from within a company, and when do you choose to leave? So I want to first start off by actually asking if anyone wants to speak to that. If anyone has had an experience where they were driven thinking like, I think I might want to leave, I'm not sure what I can do here. Is there something I can do? Does anyone actually want to share any struggles they've had with that? As a reminder, you can request to share audio and video in the top right of the video section. If you'd like to jump in, you can do audio only as well. Or alternatively, go ahead, Dave.
If no one else wants to jump in, I'll at least offer an example. I worked at Google for 7 years as a technical writer, and I loved the company. I wasn't wild about the job. It had one consistent issue that I struggled with my entire time there, and I characterize that as responsibility without authority. And that means I had the responsibility to deliver specific kinds of documentation, but I did not have the authority to publish my own documentation. That was done by developers. And yet, if that documentation failed, I was responsible for that. So responsibility without authority was a constant issue in my day-to-day work life. Does that fold into this at all?
Yeah, it definitely does. Is when you want to be doing something and you don't actually have the authority to act on what you're trying to do. That's a great example. I know Sarah's typing, so I'm also watching the chat. To sort of get it started here, is something that I thought here it's kind of terrifying as someone who's still early in their career. This is on page 66, is, be willing to say the thing that might get you fired. Because if you're not, then you're holding back. Otherwise, you're giving the answer you think people want to hear, or the answer you think saves your skin. That's not the job. Your job is to design things the right way, the ethical way, even if it gets you fired. They should teach you that in design school, especially now that the alternative might include going to jail. There was an earlier section about, people who actually did end up, getting fired or getting in legal trouble for work that they had done. And that really got me thinking of, how is that actually possible? Like, are we in a position to be able to say stuff that will get us fired? I think this is sort of a quote here that feels admirable, but how many of us are actually likely to, say the thing that's going to get us fired, that's going to, be the right thing to do, but might, threaten our jobs? Has anyone ever taken that kind of step before? Has anyone said something before where they were like, this might not actually, or this might be controversial enough that it puts, my position in jeopardy? Has anyone had that kind of situation before?
I'm not sure that I've had. Oh, so I'm not. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Did I step over?
Oh, no. I'm looking at the chat. Please go for it, Josh. Please jump in.
I'm never sure that I've ever said the thing where I've actually thought like this might literally be the end of my job if I speak up right now. But certainly have been in situations where I knew that pushing back wouldn't be well received. Like, and I don't have my camera on at the minute, but you know, I'm a 30-something white dude in tech. I can say a lot and get away with a lot, and so I use that to my advantage when I can. Is, you know, you're sort of have this sort of white guy respectability that sort of lets you, I don't know, I have a long leash, I guess, and so trying to, you know, that's bad, generally speaking, but it could be sort of put to, you know, you can sort of be the blast shield at the front of a policy that might be a lot worse for other people who really don't have the leverage to speak up. And I've sort of done that before, because I knew I could sort of quote unquote get away with it. Because you can't actually get away with a lot, depending on who you are. Get away with a lot more than I think most people think you can. There's sort of this idea that, like, you know, it's very expensive for companies to get employees, and I think knowing that works to your advantage. They really probably don't want to fire you, and if they really do, then like you probably don't want to be there. Like, and I know that there's a lot of privilege unpacking in being able to have the flexibility to be like, well, fine, then I'll just leave, or they can fire me. But it's actually not as likely as you feel it's going to be, I think. So there's a lot of, you know, a lot of uncertainty and stuff there, but it's, I think ultimately is a lot more achievable than it feels like.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Josh. I know you said that you haven't read the book yet. There's actually a whole section that sort of dives into this. You know, Mike at one point in the, you know, as says, you know, I am a guy who looks like every other, you know, guy in tech, and he says, look at the back cover. You know, he says, check out my face on the back cover of this book. And there's a whole chapter, you know, that's the one that's called All the White Boys in the Room, that's dedicated towards, you know, the topic of, you know, what it means to look like what people expect, you know, someone in tech to look like, and what it means to not look like that. So I think you bring up a really good point, is the amount of leverage that you have might be very dependent on, you know, your race or your ethnicity or your gender, and not just, you know, how you're able to articulate yourself or what, you know, position you hold. That's a really good point. I want to give a second to read Sarah's comment. This says, I worked in the content / edtech space for a few years. Protecting students from disinformation was one of my goals. It wasn't always easy to raise questions, but it helped when I talked about it broadly and looped in other professionals in the field. I don't think I achieved all of my goals in the job, but some progress was made. Sarah, I don't know if you want to elaborate about that on stage, or if you'd rather not. You can also keep your camera off if that's fine. But yeah, I think that this is something, like, I don't know if you want to talk more. Okay, I actually see you jumping in right now, so I'll let you hop in. I keep saying hop in, and that's why, and that's, so I keep saying hop in. It's not a pun, guys, I swear.
Thank you, Amy. I just needed like a second to make sure you don't see my messy background. I moved my laptop a few inches. But to elaborate on what I said, so I believe that it's a critical situation to be in when you are aware of some policies that you personally disagree with, and addressing those, to your point, and to Josh's point, and to Dave's point, it can be critical, and depending on who you are and what you bring to the table. And just this morning, I read the news that one of the fathers of AI, his name is Geoffrey Hinton, he quit Google, and one of the reasons why he quit was because of ethical reasons. So this is a pattern. It's not only in edtech space and content, but apparently the ethical concerns are going to keep growing and growing. In that specific job, what I try to do is to not focus on a specific, if you may, issue, but rather address the disinformation more broadly, and just to open a conversation where we can be more self-critical. Like, as a company, let's admit that there is disinformation in the world. As a company, as UX designers, as product people, what can we do to protect students specifically from the consequences of disinformation. And these products are the way they are because of the way we are designing them and defining them to be. So it really got a really good traction once we started talking about it from that angle, especially when we started looping in other people from different industries, experts from, we've had a really good talk at Southwest EDU, and we had Cindy Otis, who was an expert in disinformation from the CIA. And we had also Claire Hartfield, who was a journalist and worked with children very closely. So I think diversity in the topic helped to bring different people into the table and talk about it from different perspectives. It really helped, and it moved the conversation a little further. So it's not only it's product design, but there's also like the user, and there's also other aspects that could be affected by it. And bringing those perspectives and put those voices into the table, I think, made some progress. So I wouldn't say we changed policies. I wouldn't say we even achieved all the goals I hoped we would achieve. Like there was still some tools in the making by the time I left, and they were still making progress on it. And I think that's part of it, just to realize that it's an ongoing process and to be patient with it, maybe. I rambled for too long, so I'm just going to pause here and
no, thank you for sharing. This is like sort of how now we're starting to like gear into it, right? This is a participatory session, and this book is just truly just the jumping off point. I'm pulling quotes, but I'm really looking to hear people's stories about how you have or have not sort of made changes from within companies and made movements. So it sounds like you pulled people in, you got people in your corner, and you started slowly moving the needle, right? It didn't get all the way there, but it sounds like you were able to, start some momentum within your work and actually make some changes, which is super great to hear. And that's something that, the author speaks to, not pulling from any particular quote here, but a sentiment that was echoed throughout the book was, don't spend your time working on things that are going to have a negative impact on people. But before you just jump ship and say, like, this company is doing bad things I don't agree with, first try to change things from the inside. And so the fact that, and so he says, do this, do what you can to make things better. But then also don't feel like you're stuck. If you feel like you can't change things, don't be afraid. So like on page 95, it says a good leadership team will ultimately get it. But a leadership team that sees itself driving into a burning forest and hits the accelerator, he says, as Twitter is doing. This book was written before, the recent Twitter fiasco. So I doubt it's any better. I probably wouldn't say anything any better now. But if a leadership team that sees itself driving into a forest and hits the accelerator, as Twitter is doing, can't be saved, at which point you need to get out of there before you're complicit in what they're doing. So he makes this distinction between, ask yourself, can I make change from the inside? Is there something that I can do? And only if you've tried and that you're going to not make any movement, then get out of there. But if you see a leadership team that's able to make those changes, then you can go for it. And in terms of like making those changes, to talk about, to jump into what you're thinking of, Josh, of like what you're able to actually get away with saying, he does have a piece of actionable advice that is, I think, takes guts, and it's something that like I personally feel like I need to work on, is just saying the like, what is the negative impact, just outright. So, he says there's a metaphor used in journalism called the inverted pyramid. In short, you're giving the most important information at the very beginning, increase the details as or if the reader continues reading the article, and then finish up with relevant background. If you've ever read the headline to a story and decide you already know everything you wanted to know, now you know why. It's by design. The inverted pyramid moves the reveal, which you've been saving up for the big finish, right to the top. So the next time you want to convince people they're making shitty software that might get people killed, start by telling them they're making shitty software that might get people killed. Then tell them why, then tell them how you can keep them from happening. I guarantee they'll stick around just a bit longer and possibly even for the whole thing. What he's referring to here is meetings are expensive. People are in too many meetings. Nobody has any time for any more meetings. So if you start with something that's like, hey, I think we're gonna like really cause some harm here, and you start with that, then people might say like, that's a bold claim. Back that up, please. Please tell me why you think this is going to happen. And then you have the floor. They have opened that door for you to make an argument, as opposed to starting with an argument and they're already thinking about like their next meeting, this other thing, this OKR they have to meet, right? They're already thinking about all these other things. So he actually recommends, for starting these conversations, actually start out really bold and really strong and say like, hey, I think this decision to, I'm going to cite like Tesla here, like remove infrared cameras from these cars is going to get people killed, right? Start with that and as opposed to like, I think our budget might be worth it. Like start with the thing that's like, we're going to hurt people, and sort of go from there. I don't know if anyone else has any particular thoughts on this. Laura, I know you said you're doing things like this every day. I don't know if you have any particular examples that you wanted to share, but I want to pause for a second to see if anyone has any other thoughts, or if we want to jump to a new topic, or if people just have questions, because I have read the book, or questions for other people who have read the book.
I think sometimes there's a lot of it's a very intimidating thing to do, or it seems like an insurmountable thing if you think you're fighting up against this large machinations of a company or like a really big objective or something, but and it can be difficult, I think, to enact, like just to get a company to do something new, because you have to build something up from the ground, but it is usually easier to stop bad ideas from happening than it is to like start new good policies. And sometimes it's there is a lot of value in keeping, even if you're not making progress on the whole, like a company, you're sort of triaging the worst ideas and keeping them from ever happening. That can be a goal in and of itself, and that's one of those things that helps. Ultimately it prevents harm, but it can be more achievable than building something new from the ground up, and some of that can just be done through like you said, nobody likes more meetings, etc. If you're like, we need to review this decision, and then now you've like bogged it down in sort of procedure, which is, we've seen some politicians are great at that. They bury unwanted bills in procedure, and officially they're not opposing the contents of the bill, but they are gumming up the works basically to the point where the thing doesn't happen. So sort of slow walking things can be a very useful way to sort of slow something down without sticking your neck out as much, perhaps.
Yeah, he speaks a little bit. He actually speaks to that at one point. I think it was he mentions ethical sabotage at one point, where it's like, if you are in a situation where you are watching, the car driving into the burning forest, and you don't have another option, you can't leave, you go somewhere else. He broadens it out and cites, people occupied, during, World War II, like if Nazis were occupying your country and you were, you couldn't leave your job, people would slow down the process. They would stop things from happening. So that actually is, you bring up a point, that is an option if you're somewhere where you can't actually go, you can't actually leave. Luckily, I would say most of us are not in a situation where we're truly stuck in a job. We can actually leave. We can quit. That is an option. We typically are not, in the face of physical danger for leaving our roles. But that also, this whole topic is very hypothetical, right? Like what can you do? And even if you are gumming up a process, especially I think in, tech roles, there's a lot of value in not always having process, moving quickly, moving fast. So I think moments where someone is explicitly slowing things down. This is, my own conjecture here. I don't know what you guys think, but I feel like that kind of behavior actually is going to get picked up on probably more easily than if you were working in a different kind of industry. moving quickly. I think if someone sees like this person keeps doing things that slow us down, I might get picked up on. But that is a super good point you bring up. And he does talk at one point about like ethical sabotage as an option in places where you're not sure. And then, okay, the Compassionate Design Pack from A Book Apart has some good titles. Thanks, Josh. That's a great link. Folks, save that. I don't know if these chats are saved. Or remember A Book Apart Compassionate Design Pack. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I want to actually give some time because we have, I think it's 15 minutes left to move on to another topic, thinking about when you're stuck, what you can do. Go ahead.
This is Dave. You actually have a half an hour left.
Oh, perfect. It's till 11:45.
11:45. So
perfect.
Knock yourself
Okay.
out. No problem.
I think I just misinterpreted the event timing. Perfect. Okay. Got it. Thank you. So I have plenty of time. I wanted to chime in on something that Sarah actually mentioned when thinking about like misinformation, disinformation, and what we're actually showing to people and the problems that have come up from a lot of news feed related or sort of algorithmically generated information, and what that means for disinformation or just misleading people or having people be in an echo chamber. This is a little bit tangential, but there is a quote about sort of accountability and algorithms and who is responsible for making these decisions. So this is, in the chapter on moving fast and breaking things, and thinking about when do we slow down and when do we ask ourselves, is something that we've built that sort of is self-serve, that's going on, its own rhythm, like an algorithm where there's not someone who's explicitly making every decision. What does that actually do? And it got me thinking about this quote because Sarah brought up, disinformation. There's this paragraph about algorithms that says the boy kings of Silicon Valley love a good algorithm. They've designed some great ones over the years, but there are some problems even the best math can't solve. There are times when you physically have to walk over to a server and pull the plug. I get why they want an algorithm to do it. Lack of accountability. Intentionally pulling the plug on someone who's trolling women on your service is a decision. It requires agency, leadership, and a point of view. But should that troll get caught in an algorithm? Well, that's a different matter. There was no intent to specifically get rid of that person. A good algorithm is the equivalent of breaking up with someone over a text message and then turning your phone off. It's cowardly. Good leaders should aspire to have their fingerprints all over hard decisions. So this is not, it was speaking specifically to like Twitter and incidents of like harassment or abuse. That's kind of he kept bringing, Twitter comes up a lot in this book. But I think this also, lends itself to disinformation, news that is not really news, sources, what's showing up in your news feeds, and Sarah's comment about, what this actually means for people who maybe don't know yet how to check their sources, how to cite their sources, right? Like, I think most of us remember when we were in grade school, it's like, don't use Wikipedia as your source, go to the sources that are cited in Wikipedia. Like, we were taught how to cite and, verify our sources. And I think that's only getting harder, right? Now there's even fewer things that are published through magazines or articles or journals or books. There's way more ways for people to self-publish on the internet. And all of that makes it very hard to fact check when it's something that's showing up in your news feed and it looks legitimate. And it's because, an algorithm, for whatever reason, checked the engagement on it, who was reading it, what are the keywords, and gave that to you. And it might not be, something that's fact checked. This book was also written before like ChatGPT took over, right? And that is its whole, I'm not going to go into AI in this talk. It's outside the scope of the book. But I also want to flag that. And, Sarah, I would love to think, it's in the ed tech space, what's that going to mean? But that is a tangent. But Sarah, I wanted to thank you for your comment on disinformation, because I feel like it's only getting harder. So yeah, thanks for bringing up that comment.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, I know we're trying not to get into AI, but whether it's AI or
we can't avoid it.
all products are boosting. There's growth, there's more features added, and that makes a lot of ethical problems to get more complex with time. Disinformation is one of them. Issues with AI is one of them too. And sometimes there's digital citizenship coming in also when it comes to teaching young people, young students, how to tell the difference between a legit source or disinformation. And I dropped the link for one of the books. I mentioned the name Cindy Otis earlier. She's the author of the book True or False, Analyst Guide to Spotting Disinformation. And it was designed or written for teenagers and young children, basically. So it's a really interesting resource if anyone is more interested in this topic.
Thank you for sharing that. I hope this chat is saved, or if we're able to collect these links, I would love to include this in some kind of, I don't know if we're able to put it in a record of this session of what other book recs came from this. Dave,
actually it is. The entire session is recorded, and that includes the chat window. And so
Awesome.
Later on, everybody will get a link to a package that contains all of the audio and video and text chat as well, so that you don't lose any information.
I don't want to lose these great book recommendations. So that's great news. So these will be saved. Folks can access them later. Yeah, I think that you bring up such a good. This is also great resources on this. Of it's getting harder, and especially young kids don't necessarily know how to tell the difference, and that difference is getting a lot harder to spot than it was when I was in elementary school, sitting in my computer lab, starting to first, type on Mavis Beacon and things like that. It's getting way harder. But what really strikes me is there are some fun facts in this book that I would love to bring up on this topic as well, of the fact that there are, it seems like, okay, we have this algorithm, right? We have these news feeds, and platforms are not necessarily, they're saying, we can't police every single post that comes through, right? We can flag things, we can pull things out. And when the answer is actually, they're pretty good at pulling things out, and they will, say things otherwise. There's one, I don't want to get into a too deep discussion about this specifically, but I think it's a great piece of food for thought that stuck with me after I read the book. So I saved this one in particular. When you want to think about what can a tech company be motivated to do given the right parameters, especially in the US, there's a lot of what is free speech? What do we allow on the platform? What do we not allow on a platform? And it can come down to when there is a hard legal line. So Twitter does not, Nazis come up with this book a lot too, where it says, Twitter has Nazis in it. There's people who are saying things, that really, I think most of us don't want to be seeing. And, Nazis will be posting on Twitter, and Twitter is they're on our platform, and we're not, we can't filter everything out. Turns out if you are in Germany, that actually does get filtered out. If you set your location to Germany, it's gone. It magically disappears. They actually do have a way of filtering it out, but they just choose not to filter that out if you live anywhere else. And I think that's just really that just sits so weird with me, right? Where it's not oh, we haven't figured it out yet, or this is very challenging to do. It's nope, we actually do it. We can do it. If you live in Germany, where there are very strict laws about you cannot have this kind of content in our country, you actually can take it out, but they opt not to. And that's the kind of thing where it's like, all right, like if you're building a product and you've got challenges, you've got problems, you've got limitations, and you're still figuring it out, and you're like, yeah, we're working on this, that's one thing. But if you can do it and you're choosing not to, like, what, I think it just kind of sits weird with me. I wanted to share that with you guys, but it's more just like a like let's think about this for a second. But I just wanted to share that quote. He really doesn't like Twitter, despite being on Twitter.
Yeah, which is a good reminder that products end up being how we design them to be, and there's always the conflict between the tech team championing ethical design and championing decisions to be made differently versus abiding with the law, and if the law is catching up to how the speed of, how fast product and technology is moving at. It's an interesting question for sure.
Yeah. Since we do have a couple new people, I've been watching the count number go in and out. If you have just joined and you're joining partway into the session, for context, this is a participatory session. You are absolutely welcome to hit that share my audio and video button and jump onto the stage and start talking. This is an open-ended discussion, so the folks up here with me are not also speakers. This is people from the audience who decided they wanted to jump in. You're also welcome to participate freely in the chat. So if you're just jumping in, this is participatory. So you do not have to just sit. If you have thoughts you want to share, just come in and join the conversation. I think what you're bringing up is a great transition to a topic that I thought was really interesting in this book, which is, I'm not going to go through the whole designer code of ethics, but I will say that Mike had one that was basically just, it's a code of ethics. Here's what I think designers should adhere to. But what I thought was really interesting was the idea of needing a license to practice design. I would say the vast majority of us are not people who have gone through the type of education that would result in licensing. But he pushes for it. And I think even if it's not something that's currently in the industry, it's something that we should all think about. And the basic analogy he has is, would you go to a doctor that is not licensed to practice medicine? Would you go to a lawyer who does not have, a license to, practice the law, who is not, licensed for this? And has design hit the point where we need a license? Because these professions that do have licenses did not always, but at some point the government decided, the government, educational institutions, powers that be, decided that there was enough potential harm that could be caused by these people who did not have, who didn't go through a specific process. There's enough potential for harm if they don't have something to prove that they have put in the work that will minimize the risk of them, causing harm through lack of knowledge or, lack of whatever. And that there is the threat where if someone does not actually adhere to, what is prescribed within their license, like if a doctor does not, has malpractice, right, they can lose their license. And there's not something like that for design right now, where there isn't that kind of accountability. And it makes it seem okay, number one, this is a big barrier to entry. He has a bunch of arguments in one of the chapters I won't get into, but basically he does have a whole section that's here's the arguments for or against licensing, and some of them that he brings up that are okay, is this going to be a barrier to entry? And he says that's a great point. This is a valid argument. We need to think about this. Cost, what kinds of things this can cause. But something I thought was really interesting was the idea that if everyone who is practicing design, either has a code of ethics or a license or just a set of agreements, essentially, that is this is what we as an industry adhere to as our standards, and included in this, because design is user-centered in theory. I have big air quotes on in theory. then what does it actually mean if we don't adhere to those? If, you know, the bottom line of the company is putting users in harm's way, at what point are we able to put down, you know, the tools and say, this is against my code of ethics, or this is something that, you know, will cause me to lose my license? It actually gives people who hold, if we have something like that, it gives people things to fall back on, where the rest of the community can say, like, hey, we have standards and you can't, you know, you just can't do this. And so even though it seems like a barrier to entry, having something like that, having something where the you know, design community as a whole, the UX community as a whole has said, hey, like, this is where we draw the line. I thought that was really, really interesting. I wanted to pause here to see if anyone has any thoughts on this, because I realize it's if you haven't thought about it before, it's like, whoa, like a license. But what do you guys think?
It's definitely a striking thought for sure. I like sometimes to, because design and UX design is fairly new, sometimes it's nice to compare it with other disciplines like architecture. When architecture first started, there was no licensing or codes for building a new building and stuff like that. But right now, you need to get the license. There are laws and regulations to make sure a building is safe, it's accessible. In case of emergencies or fire, there's a way for people to get out safely, et cetera, but we don't really have the same standards and regulations in UX design. Although when you're building like a social media or a content platform, it's like building a mall or a large building with a lot of people can come in, and there's a lot of questions still with what design patterns are okay to use and others are not safe for people's privacy and even their mental health, and how design is going to impact their user behavior accordingly too. So it's a big question for sure.
Yeah, I love the question that Chad also put in the chat just now, was, would a license stop you from doing what the CEO demands? Should you have to have a license to be a CEO? That is a great question. Should you have to have a license to be a CEO, to be a leader of a company? I think that's, you know, my hot take is there should be some, you know, some requirements, you know, some people at least having certain degrees or certain education. But also there's a lot of people who are, you know, small time. I think there was that actually does make me think, you know, when does having a license for any role come to matter? And I don't have this quote bookmarked, but, you know, he mentions, you know, do you need a license to practice design in general? Like, no. Are you doing it for a small business? Like, you don't need a license. If you're doing it for your friends, no. But if you are working on a product that is going to impact 2 billion people, you should probably have some kind of check. Like, you shouldn't, you know, he does say, you know, like, where is it? Sorry, one second. Imagine every fresh graduate doing a 5-year paid apprenticeship, working for someone who could teach them how the job actually gets done. Sadly, you're more likely to see a lineup of luxury buses in the parking lot at graduation, ready to take a fresh crop of newly minted designers to Google or Amazon or Facebook. They'll be offered dangerous jobs, given precious little training, and be told to work at an alarming pace and be on call 24/7. They'll do what they're told. They'll make crap. Most of them will have short, unhappy careers, but that's okay because there's always a fresh batch of new graduates. Thanks, Sarah, for joining us. Good, Jared. Sarah dropped off, but yeah. So I think the idea here is scale. Is it depends where you're working and what level of training you might require. So if you're working on something that is going to have a massive impact on a lot of people, that merits a higher level of, you know, verification that you are qualified to do your job and you have the knowledge and skills at hand. But that also makes me think this is a really good point, though, is, you know, at what point, like, what if you're already a practicing designer working in a small scale? At what point is it like, okay, I need to pause and like do some extra education to get a license to now work on, you know, do you have it? How do you stop your working to like then do that? And, does it become something that's more like, medical school or any other thing where you have to like go through a secondary education, right? Like, what does that look like? But Chad, this is a really good point. And I think the idea is, would a license stop you from doing what the CEO demands? Mike would argue yes, because if you shift the framework to what if someone is asking a doctor to do something that violates, their oath that they've made or would cause them to lose their license, that's something they can fall back on and say like, hey, this violates, my oath as a doctor. This will cause me to lose my license. And that's pretty not refutable, right? And if someone is pushing for that, that's just a very black or white moment of like, that, obviously there's gray areas if someone can make an argument whether something does or does not, fall outside, permissible bounds. But it's a tool that one can use to say like, hey, this is not right. But if we don't have a code of ethics, if we don't have a license, there is no boundary. Like, it just becomes a personal boundary, right? Of like, this is where I draw my own, product person line in the sand. And there's nothing to fall back on other than like, we collectively as a community kind of think this is a bad idea. And yeah, we designed to AA accessibility standards. We see that as a legal requirement, doesn't require a license, and we use that as a boundary. Yeah, that's a fair point. I don't know, if you want to speak to that, Chad, if you want to jump up on stage also. I think you're bringing up really good points. The point being, there is a repercussion to not adhering to, standards, whatever those standards may be it accessibility, ethics. Okay, not in a great place for audio, all good. But having something that is not just your own personal morals or like, I feel like this is a bad thing to do, having something that's kind of written down somewhere, right? That's like, this is what is within legal bounds. Like, if you don't adhere to accessibility standards, there can be lawsuits. That is an option. Whereas, it then falls, I guess in the case of, if you do something unethical and someone gets hurt, there can still be lawsuits, right? But ultimately, even thinking about accessibility standards, I feel like threat of lawsuit should not necessarily be the standard for like, what do we decide to do and not do, especially because, a lot of end users are not the people who have the resources to start a legal case. So that's also just something to, think about. But I think the answer is a license may stop them right now. If a CEO is pushing you to do something you don't want to do, it falls on, you and the people in your corner to advocate for yourselves, and you don't necessarily have like something to, aren't licenses and education to keep you from breaking laws? That's a big question. I don't know if anybody else wants to hop in and take stance on this. Is it to keep you from breaking laws?
Yeah, I mean, I think licenses sort of hold different roles, and some of them are a little, like sometimes it's just to say, okay, if you're hiring someone for a role and you need to know with some reasonable certainty that they hold X expertise, you can say, okay, anyone with this license is supposedly, capable of doing this baseline set of activities or whatever. And so some of it is just a hiring bar, and just not necessarily an ethical line in the sand, but it can be both, I think. I guess it depends on what kind of license. I mean, I'm thinking something like they're not licenses, but the like accessibility credentials. There's like optional, certifications, and they sort of signal like, this is the level of expertise I have. This is the sort of training I've gone through. But it doesn't necessarily imply that, you're going to, be legally required to act a certain way.
Yeah.
But those are optional, and they're from a particular trade group, not necessarily something that's, there's multiple ways to go about that.
And I don't see licenses as a character trait either. For example, we don't have, licenses in the like UX industry right now. And there's a lot of people who I would trust very much to do the work that they're doing. I think that the argument that Mike largely makes is that it is a strong indicator of whether you can trust someone to do the job that they say they are able to do. If you have right now, I think especially in the UX industry, like myself included, like I don't have a design education, right? And for me, like there's a lot of us who don't have the education that says like I am licensed or I have this degree. And there's a lot to be said for the people who do. There's a different section of the book that I'm not even going to get into with time constraints. That's digging into whether design education in general is doing itself justice right now. Mike's take is no, but I will leave you to the book to actually dig into that topic. But they're an indicator of trust and whether and whether people who are employing you to use your skills and your services, whether you have the know-how to actually do that without, making a mistake or causing harm.
And I think obviously with like 5 minutes left, you can't unpack all of capitalism or whatever, but a lot of these things, like I noticed actually when you held up the book, there was like a badge on the front. There was sort of like an alert to Amazon workers.
Awesome. It's not, if you look at the event description for my event, this is not the cover. I received this book and was like, this is great.
But like so many of these things, like you're saying, this idea that I love that quote about the decisions, good leaders should want their fingerprints all over decisions. I feel like there's a lot of waffling. There was a very terribly awkward interview with the like CEO of Substack, sort of like trying to whiff on ethical questions, because I think they just don't want to offend anyone. They just want to be able to expand unbounded, their market forever. And I think that that force alone drives a lot of these decisions. People saying like, I want to speak up ethically, but I'm afraid I'll lose my job. We don't have worker representation that's strong enough. All these things are sort of interrelated aspects of the bigger like imbalance of, how is wealth being generated and who's generating it and how, that is probably an essential part of fixing this. Because, we say, okay, well, yeah, licenses, but, if you're still working for a company that's profiting off of privacy exploiting, ads or whatever, then like it's still, it helps, but it's also still sort of not getting at the root cause. So anyway, yeah, there's just so much to unpack here. I definitely want to read this book when I get a chance. Yeah. But I think all these questions are super necessary to have, and I'm glad that definitely when there are books that aren't afraid to be very vocal and make bold statements, basically, to not waffle on it, So.
Yeah. And chat, I do want to acknowledge your point in chat. I'm not for or against licenses. I agree that they indicate a standard of knowledge. I just don't think that licenses make people do good or bad. That's a fair point. I think that licenses will give people who want to do good something to fall back on if they're being asked to do something bad, to use sort of black and white terms. And then for people who are, people who may be more willing to, do something that, their PM or their CEO asks, I think it gives this point of like, kind of like, hey, you are potentially crossing this boundary. It adds a pretty discreet checkpoint. Whereas right now, I think without either a code of ethics or that's something that's like generally agreed upon, I think it's very fuzzy. Everyone who has a driver's license drives the speed limit, right? Exactly. But like, right? There's a big point in a lot of these tabs I have here that is, he says, this is not black and white. There's a lot of times that you may do something that is ethically wrong, especially if you need to put food on the table to get into capitalism and healthcare. He's like, people do things to not lose their job because they have healthcare from their job and their kids are depending on them for their healthcare. Like, and he just says, if you need to do things to keep your job and survive, do them. Like, I'm not going to stop you from surviving, but please just be cognizant and know that this is why you are doing X, Y, or Z, is because you need to do this to survive. So like he actually makes that distinction of like, this is not like I am telling you everything, but it is just a, hey, these are things to be aware of. And if you are not doing these things, know that you are not doing these things, or you are doing these things. So he makes those distinctions. I wanted to end, I know we're at time.
We are.
End with one quote that I think is a good actionable thing to take away from here, and then we'll wrap up. Which is, I think one of the most actionable things I took from this book was this idea of a veil of ignorance, which is a way of determining whether what you're designing, be it a startup, a dinner plan, or a system of government, is just. It's very simple. When designing something, imagine that your relationship to that system gets determined after you've made it. For example, if you're designing a system of government that allows slavery, you might end up being enslaved. If you're designing a ride-sharing service, you might end up as the driver or the rider. With a veil of ignorance in place, you see yourself from the rider's perspective, and you might start considering things like what to do if the driver makes a pass at you. Of course, this is more likely to be considered when your team includes women, but I wanted to end on that quote that I think is actionable for anyone who is designing any product, is think about if you have no control over where you end up in that system. Are there places you wouldn't want to end up, or places you would? And that's what I'm going to leave it on. But
think about where it goes after it's finished.
Right. Where does it go? So like I said, this is not me going over the book. This is me using us as a jumping off point. I really encourage folks to read this. It is not very long. I filled it with tabs. So I hope this has been fun for you guys. I hope this has given you some food for thought. But I will let Dave wrap things up.
Wow. So yes, big thanks to everyone. That was super good. This kind of session frequently starts off kind of slow, and then picks up steam, and this one did that. So I was really glad to see that. You had a number of participants. Thanks to everybody for hanging in there, and thanks to Emi for a really nice session. That was very clever. I may have to go read that book now.
It's very
I was unaware of it at all.
It's not a long read.
While you were speaking, I ran over to Amazon and checked out some reviews, and it looked really, really interesting. So might have to pick that up. And Josh makes a great point there. Try to find a worker-owned bookseller. That's a good idea, rather than just buying everything from Amazon. Sorry about that. If you get it from
Amazon, hopefully it has this cover, so whoever is picking and packing your book gets a good reminder.
There you go. All right. Well, I will close out then, and thanks to Emi again, and thanks to everyone for participating. And we will, let's see, we've got another session starting here in 15 or 12 minutes about. So thanks again, and we'll see you in the next session.
All righty. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thanks, Emi.